Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and welcome to Conversations. Today, we're going to be talking about designing conversational AI experiences for children and older adults. So I'm very excited about this topic, and we have an awesome panel of experts. And let's just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get started. Monique, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Monique Howard. I am a founder of Smarticles, and what we do is we create activities for children who are on the spectrum. The goal is to help them to improve their conversation. That's where we started out. We pivot now to give the full service for not only the children but also the parents in helping them find activities that they can actually do at home. And we can capture that information to then feed back into a system that tells them, hey, has the child improved or do we need to do some other games? So we're really excited about that because we know that today in the education system here in the US, a lot of kids fall through the cracks or don't get the services that they need. And we are looking to fill that gap.
Love that. Falene, you want to?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Falene, and my expertise is in building conversational AI systems through robots or generative AI games for the very young and the exceptionally old. So I've worked with companies like Intuition Robotics, which built LEQ for older adults, Curiosity Robotics, which built ICO for children to teach them English from age 2 very early. And so you understand the problems with that. And then as well, with right now, I'm working with a company called UG Labs, and we are building conversational AI, voice generative AI interactional games for children. It's a very exciting space, so it's lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. Brett?
Yeah, hi, my name is Brett Adler. I've been in software for nearly 30 years now, and a couple of years ago, I got into the conversation design industry because I built a Amazon Alexa-based voice assistant to guide people through their physical therapy at home. I had to build it for myself after a couple of surgeries, and so I really got into the space, and just happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much all for joining. I guess I'll just get right into it. My first question, it's kind of loaded, but how do you tailor language complexity, tone, and pacing for different age groups, especially when there's so many different levels, I guess, of those three aspects within like children and older adults? It's so broad. Falene, you want to start?
Yeah, that is a very interesting, very complex question that is not easily solvable. And we can tell that it's not easily solvable by the amounts of groups that aren't doing it. Currently, there is an issue with understanding different phoneme types and the lack of understanding. There's also a bit of confusion that comes when you have a system that doesn't necessarily understand word repeats, like I want, and it becomes difficult in both age ranges, the young and the old. I'm also going to add to the question of how do you deal with the difficulties. When you have older adults, you have a lot more fricatives. So you'll have a lot of movement in the mouth that makes it so that the speech recognition has a harder time because there are more sounds that are misunderstood. Now, the way to do this is a little bit fuzzy. So you can kind of understand vaguely what it should be with the introduction of LLMs for specifically understanding intentions rather than just using a basic NLP. This has really helped because you're able to say, okay, generally, what do you think that this is supposed to be saying? But companies like the one that I'm currently working with, UG Labs, they actually spent months gathering data on children speaking so that they were able to help process their ASR to go directly to understand children specifically. And then this is not without even adding the considerations of dialectal differences, but looking at specifically American and American children, you can have those different levels for understanding phonemes, for understanding word repetitions, and for understanding the fricatives that are going to be there. And you can put that into a system to create a fuzzy logic. And that is my answer.
Brett, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, I found for both kids and older adults, keeping the language plain and straightforward, and a bit of a, I don't say slow pace, but a little bit of a slower pace so that they can, follow and listen. I do think that, the tone often would be different for kids versus older adults. So I think you want to be a little more playful, a little more interactive, right, with kids, and with older adults, I don't think they like as much of the, sort of that, and want a little more straightforward. And also a lot more ability to repeat, to hear it again, to make sure it's clear, right? Having, we'll get into this probably more later, but the multimodal, so you can also see what they're, they want to be able to see what's being said as well, so they can really follow along. And I think just, empathetic especially for older adults, I think is important.
Absolutely. Monique?
Yeah, just as I said, I deal with little kids and their palates and all of that's not really developed. So it's kind of like what you said. They'll say things that you don't understand, or that Alexa. I started out with Alexa, didn't understand. So we had to develop for that, right? Those are some things that obviously very early on, Alexa would just like, I don't understand. One of the things that we had to do was we had to fix it so that she'll say, oh, okay, I like that. And say something else so that the conversation goes on, because you don't want to frustrate the child. Obviously, in real life, the same thing may happen. They go to speech therapy, or they're in class and they may have an issue with conversation, and someone constantly saying, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you say that again? Or they feel a little bit dismissed. And so that's what we're really conscious about, is that what can we do to help the conversation continue, even if it's not understood? Because the goal is for the child to have that back and forth, regardless of what the words that are being said. And so that's why we decided that, hey, we're just going to continue a conversation in a funny way so that they don't feel like they're being judged for what they're saying, and they will continue playing the game.
Right.
I'd like to jump in there with something that is interesting, because it's a difference between young children and older adults. Because with young kids, you want to move forward. Young kids kind of understand that they may not be fully understood. The younger you get, the more likely that is to be the case that you can move forward with. So like 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, you just continue forward, amazing. But when you get to 98, the problem is you have the same sort of speech recognition problems, and you have the same sort of cadence in the person's speech. However, they have the intention that they need to be understood, and having a system that doesn't quite understand them is a lot more problematic. So in those cases, we often want to see that there is a question of, do we have the confidence that we understood what they said? And if we don't, maybe we say, listen, my mics are not great. My speakers don't work so well. Tell me again, because listen, someone of us needs a hearing aid. It's not you, it's me. And then that way we can progress, but we also make sure that we have those repetitions, because that intention is different among the different groups. And I think that it's interesting because that is one of the differences, even though there's a lot of similarities in design.
That's very interesting. Thanks for, oh, Monique, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say that I'm glad you pointed that out, because it is one of the things that, and knowing in our families, we have older people, right? And the same thing. They want to still feel like they have that same vibrance that they had before, even though they're slowing down. So I'm glad that she brought up that point. With kids, like she said, they move forward. You can say something funny, a joke, make them laugh, and then they'll forget that they were, something, and they will continue on. Whereas with the older group, you definitely have to acknowledge, what they're doing in some sort of way. So I'm glad that she actually brought up that point.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch back on something that I think Brett was mentioning, and I think is also maybe intertwined with this, on the role of personality. Like, how much do you think personality matters in these interactions? And if you see any differences in the kind of personality you want to have for the younger children compared to older adults?
And even different personalities within the different ages especially with children too. I'm curious.
So I would love to jump in with this, even though you mentioned Brett directly, and I'll be very short because I love personality. I think that when you start removing modalities, you need to bring up the characterization. You need to bring up the voice. It's one of the reasons why I really loved working with Jason Gilbert, because he designs characters like nobody's business. And he taught me that this is really important. So with older adults, what we found was it needed to be caring and friendly and a little bit like ribbing, but not too much. So it had the jokester, but it was very serious. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting between all age groups is that we typically want to design it as, I'm caring, I'm nice. Never use nice. Nice is a terrible descriptor. LLMs also hate it if you use it in prompts. It doesn't know what it is. It's nice. It's there and it's helpful. But when you get to those sort of extreme ages, that sort of customer service bot doesn't work. And with younger kids, the more expressive the voice, the better. I've actually recently worked with 11 Labs, and they had this amazing voice. I think the name is Arestia, and it was so colorful and so character-driven that you could reduce the personality just a little bit, and the voice would bring it forward. And what we found is that with younger kids, voice matters. The cadence of the voice, the sound of the voice. If it goes too slowly, it's not great. But with older adults, you can keep it more of a subtle voice. You can go with one of the standard ones like Sally from AWS, and they like that just fine, even though it's very old. Joanna is a good one, even though she sounds like a smoker. But they don't mind the slowness. But kids, vibrant, big, amazing, just so it sounds like someone is looking at you and going, I love this. And the voice can bring so much personality out of there. But I'll just end with, I also think you should always design a quirk. Your character must love blueberries. And somewhere they need to mention blueberries, because people build that emotional connection, the subtle trust, when there's that weird quirk. And it especially works with children and also with older adults who now think that they know something about the character and they're able to work with it better.
Monique, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I was waiting for Brett, but I'll go ahead and jump in. So yeah, with children, what we found is that, just like to say, the character more kind of out there, very in front of them, making jokes, making fun, asking. We decided to put in the, I didn't say that, but the first thing we did was build an Alexa skill. And so what we decided to do is put in a little banter in there as well for them, right? Or, it was a coloring app. So we didn't name the colors general color, blue, red, green. We named it slime green, or, bubblegum this, or rainbow this. And they could say anything. They can make up their own color. And we're like, oh, okay, that's fun. You color yours that, and I will color mine this color. And so it's bringing to the conversation not only character and tone, but choice. And then one other thing we tried to do is break it up. So it's not always conversation. In our skill, what it did was it would say, oh, I like this song. Let's listen to it while we color. Or I like this poem. Let me tell you about it. And while the Alexa is saying the poem, there's sound effects and there's all of this that kind of immerse them into the entire play of things. So it's really, you think about tone and all of everything else, but you add the extra for children because you want them to come back and really enjoy the experience.
No, I love what both of you said, and I'll just add, I have more experience on the older adult side, and something we did with the Voice PT is try to find a balance between repeating the same thing. Like, so people are doing exercise, right? So it's a very repetitive kind of experience. And so we found that it was best to have some variability in certain areas, but other areas to always repeat the same thing. So when you're starting an exercise or you're ending an exercise, it seemed to work best to have the same words every time, because they start to trigger and know, okay, this is the beginning or this is the end. But like when we'd say hello in the beginning, or goodbye, or good job, or certain things, then we would try to vary it up so it didn't sound, because if all you hear is the same good job 50 times, it starts to lose its value, right? But on the other hand, when they're sitting there getting that muscle memory of doing the exercises, there's something to be said for some of those same signals over and over again. So that's what we went with.
Yeah, no, I'm curious about like how. Oh, Falene, go ahead.
Oh
Did
no,
you have
I wasn't
Oh,
going
sorry,
to.
sorry. That's never mind. So I actually wanted to go a little bit more into like how you tested with all of these experiences and how you kind of found out what you needed to kind of get them to be engaged, and how, if you tested with different age groups, like how you kind of found your audience, I guess. Monique, do you want
Yeah,
to start with
I'll
this
go
one?
first. So we started out making, and I'll go back, we had a coloring skill. So we started out developing it. But obviously, the further you get from childhood, you forget how fun, right? How much fun you used to have, what you used to do. So I decided to have a Zoom call, and it was during COVID, a Zoom call with a bunch of kids. I sent their parents the coloring sheets and the books and just colored with them and listened to what they would say, and how they would interact, and it just brought back the memories of being a child, and what in the classroom you're coloring with your peers and what they would do and say. What was interesting is we were coloring and we knew that we had to eventually give them more time because they might say, I'm not finished. But one of them said, I have to color all of the white. And I was like, I never thought of that, right? He wanted to color this, there was a sky on it, and he wanted to color all of it. We assumed that, hey, they were just going to color the sun and the cloud and leave the rest white. And he was like, wait a minute, I'm not finished. I have to color the white. And so those types of interactions helped us a lot in forming what we have today. And it's still on Alexa. And it was fun because, like I said, it reminded me of my childhood, but it also reminded us that, hey, as adults, you definitely, you're going to go and serve a child and their needs, then you definitely need to be in their world, and that allow us to do that.
So I would love to add to this because I do think that it's very interesting. Speaking of the things that we don't necessarily remember or know that we'll need, Brett brought something up earlier, and I'm going to throw it in here, which is multimodality. And we love multimodality. It's amazing, whether it's the multimodality of movement in a robot or a screen or some type of text or some type of vibration. One of the things that I remember coming as a shock to me was, oh yeah, that's right, children can't read. And also, older adults cannot see screens. They still want to have the screens, but a lot of them start getting glaucomas, and it becomes more and more and more difficult. And so if you want them to do, let's say, an exercise, you need them to walk away from the screen, and suddenly the screen is gone to them. And so this is something that we learned, well, we should have known, but we forgot. As Monique said, the further away you are from something, the harder it is to remember. And so that was with us. I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought that was a really good connection.
Yeah, we experienced sort of two waves of testing. The first wave was more remote testing, and what we experienced was a lot of issues, people even just getting it set up, right? Like, especially with the Alexa skill, like to me, it always seems pretty straightforward, but didn't really think enough through like how difficult it would be for people to just get it going, right? And so that, and set up. And so we learned a lot about just the initial setup phase. And then my favorite part was actually when we were doing the video for that Amazon Alexa hackathon that we participated in. And that was remote for me, but we had a camera crew there, and it was really fun to watch as these older adults, they were filming them and they had never used the app. And they didn't have to worry as much about the setup, so they got to go right into, because the crew set it up for them. But what was good for me is I got to see the joy, like the excitement, like it was fun to watch the way they interacted, and like were sort of amazed at what it could do, right? They had never used anything like that before, and the smiles that they had and the way. So that was just, a really good experience for me, was to see how happy people got with the experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal with with a lot of these things, is just to help people and to just make their lives better. And that's great that you were able to see that. And going back, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, because I think that this is an interesting one, and I don't know if you guys have also experienced this, but you mentioned two phases of testing. There was the type of reiterative testing that we got from doing A/B testing, where we'd say we're going to do this or this. but there was also the interference kind of testing where we would bring somebody into a home and we'd have them sit there as they interacted with the system. And I think that a lot of companies, and in many of the companies I've worked for, we fell into that, where we either had it remote, which gave us lots of really good data about how people choose to interact with it on their own. And we had the interference kind of testing where we lost a little bit because we were the ones who kind of hedged the bets, and we said, okay, this is how you're going to do it. We're going to install it. We're going to show you this. And that gave us really good sort of content that we should create, but it didn't necessarily give us the UX flow or the CUX flow that we needed to make the system happen without us. And so I think that those are interesting types of testing. And personally, I prefer the fully remote, only look at the data, because as much as I get so much joy from seeing a kid just a robot say, stand up and clap your hands and turn around, and a kid speaks no English, but suddenly they're doing it because they understand these words, that's so cool. But at the same time, it's not something you can necessarily use as much as you could if you could just use the data that comes in if you're fully remote. And so I do want to throw out that those are the two that we ended up using in every company that I've worked with, and they give different results.
Monique, I'm curious how you were able to like recruit the children that you tested with. Did you like go to schools, or did you use like, I guess, what was your approach to the,
Well, it was during COVID, parents, we were
Right.
part of I think it was toward the end of the lockdown, but kids were still at home. So parents wanted something for their kids to do. It wasn't hard at all, right? Word of mouth and sending some information to schools. At that time, my children are older, but the schools that they went to, sending information to the schools so they can give it out to the parents. But like I said, we didn't have any, it wasn't hard. I mean,
Right.
it didn't feel like babysitting. It felt like the kids were still interacting in play as opposed to interacting online in class, where it was difficult for them to kind of sit and listen and understand and absorb. But when they were online coloring, hey, most kids, I started saying all kids, but then I met a parent who was like, well, my kid doesn't like to color. I was like, okay, I need to change my language. So, but most kids love to color, especially when it's with someone else. And when they're at home, if they have older brother or siblings, there isn't a partner, right? So it was like, okay, yes, I would love to let my child do this. I kept getting afterwards, are you going to do this again? Are you going to set it up as a recurring thing? I'll pay you. I was like, well, no, we're just kind of doing some research. But yeah, it was really easy because of the time that we were in.
Right. That makes sense. So I want to pivot a little bit to anything you've learned that's kind of been surprising about how children or older adults interact with these kind of experiences, or just AI in general across different regions and cultures. So I know, there are different levels of familiarity and Falene?
So I would love to talk about something that I find really surprising, and it is about how little people, including parents, think about regulation and compliance and the data of their children. The current company that I'm with, and I'm going to give a little shout out to them, they make sure that they're COPA compliant, meaning that they go and they figure out which states require what so that they can interact with children and they can have all of the correct things. They are kid safe certified, which means they actually went through the effort of ensuring that children are protected in a way that you don't typically see. And the reason for this is because, like, as an adult, listen, if you have CapCut recently, you probably saw the terms and service update, which says that now they can use anything that you publish or work on through them at their own will, anywhere. And we just sign away our rights with that willingly, but children don't have that right. They don't have that condition. They don't have that concern. And so by making sure that you as a company work through that and try to focus on that really sells to people. Now, it does take extra effort and it is very difficult. But I think that what you'll find is that a lot of people don't fully consider the safety and the privacy of children. And when it comes to older adults, we often assume that they're able to make their own decisions and they fully understand the technology. But I remember going through a research system where we installed robots into people's houses, and we told them that there was a camera. And it wasn't until it was in their house for like a week that we started getting complaints being like, is the camera taking pictures? And we had to explain that any system that has Wi-Fi and a camera could potentially record stuff, that we weren't using it and we've closed it off and there's no way we can access it, but it could potentially, and that is a danger. And people didn't understand that. Like the users, the clients, as well as other companies that were working with us didn't understand that. And I think that's fairly interesting and something that was learned along the way, at least for me.
I think that's really a good point around privacy for kids. For us, we did not ask for names. We did not ask because I had children. And even though my kids are teenagers, we still we're at the point where, hey, we want to protect them as much as possible. Right. And so that was in my mind. Obviously, Amazon had their own standards, right? But even as a developer in a company, you still have to put yourself in the mind of that. How do you protect that? Not only their name and their person, but also if you are capturing what they're saying, that information of how it's being used. So that was really important for us as well. I think the one thing in dealing with kids and technology, they just gravitate to it like fly to, I don't know, honey or something, a bee's honey, whatever the saying is. And it was so easy to kind of get them engaged with it. I think the one thing that I always knew, but I discovered even more, is that they will continue to try, even though, like with Alexa, I don't understand. We try our best to, with those fallback intents, make it a little bit more engaging, but they will continue to try and in that conversation and try to even say some different things. And that was what we wanted. And just to kind of divert a little bit on why we built this, I had my son on a spectrum, and he did the same thing. He took my Alexa and he was talking to it, even though his language was limited, he just kept trying and kept thinking of words and going back looking for words and coming saying new words. And so that for me was the aha moment, in that even though kids who are on the spectrum, you don't limit them, and an Alexa was an opportunity for them not to feel judged, right? Not to feel the pressure to perform, but that they can say and be themselves and just enjoy the experience. So that for us was really kind of the aha moment, and continue to push me forward, because I know that in their own way and in their growth, they can chart their path. We are there just to kind of steer, right, to see and to give more information. But honestly, they are able to chart their path toward communication that we may not have ever thought of before.
So I want to throw something out there before Brett jumps in with his really, really, really important stuff, because I know that he has a lot of experience with this. Okay, just 1 second. There's a siren, so I'm going to have to leave shortly. However, one of the things that I want to point out is that we have an obligation as designers and developers in order to make sure things are safe. Character AI is a really good point. There was a kid in February who unalived himself, and the mother blames the generative AI system that talked to him. Okay, now I have to leave. I'm so sorry. I'm going.
Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll build off what Monique and Falene said. I think that in my experience, the older adults they're more likely to give up and get frustrated with the system and not keep trying to work around it. And I've also noticed sometimes they'll start trying 10 different ways to say things that sometimes makes it actually worse, and the other part that really surprised me, and to be honest was one of our issues as a business, was that people really seem to view these smart displays at home as like different and than like their phone and their computer. So there would be a lot of people say, oh, I don't want this thing listening to me, right? Or I don't, but they would bring their phones into the bathroom, but they wouldn't want this speaker in the living room, right? And there's sort of this disconnect, I think, personally, or inconsistency, where the feeling is like these smart speakers are, bugging devices that are always listening and watching and doing all that, but my laptop and my computer and all these other devices are not. And we just struggled a lot to get over that hump. So there were a lot of people that just didn't want those devices in their home at all. So.
Do you think that's because they're using their voice more, or do you think there's another reason?
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I wonder. There were, I guess, two quick thoughts on that. One is that there were some early reports on some of these devices that were keeping recordings. And so I think that news got out there and gave, kind of a bad first impression to people. And then as someone else said to me once, it's not that we don't know that the other devices can equally do that, but like, I can't not have a phone. I need my laptop. I need my tablet. I don't need the speaker. So they would see it as, why should I add that in when I don't need to have, they didn't feel as much of a necessity, whereas to them, the phone was, they have to have it. So they didn't see it, even if it bothered them, they didn't treat it differently.
Right.
And I just wanted to add to that, the speaker talks back, and that's a different dynamic. Whereas your phone, it really doesn't do anything, even though the phone works the same way. If you have Siri on your phone, you talk to it, it talks back. But they feel like with an Alexa, they feel like, oh, she's going to talk at any time, right? So she has to know what's going on in my house or what I'm doing, and so on and so forth. Like Brett says, the early reports and continuous reports from around Alexa did not help at all. But definitely people feel like Alexa is a person, right? That is watching me or can hear me, so on and so forth. And so that part stayed with it for a very long time. And so I believe that also contributed to it.
Yeah, I agree. Just to add quickly to that, the other thing that I think people were hearing about is that, and I know it can happen with your phone too, but I think there were more instances of it hearing you and initiating something without you wanting it to, right? Like it made phone calls, and this is all the platforms, not just Amazon, right? But like they hear something and they activate. Whereas I know it can happen on the phone, but a lot of people have turned off that ability on their phones or just don't. And it's not as conversational, like Monique said. So it's more, typically when I talk to Siri, if it doesn't understand me or whatever, it just, it's a one-off thing. It's not the multi-turn, right? And so you don't have that same feeling, and you don't feel as often that it just acts on its own or could accidentally, act on its own, because it's always listening, whereas the phone might be in your pocket and not hear you as often, except for when you're intending it to be heard.
Yeah, makes sense. I was thinking about a sort of pattern we tend to always have about conversation design and building trust, and how important that is, so that then all the interaction thrives based on that trust you build, especially in the first moments. Is there anything specific you've learned about building trust with either older adults or younger kids that is specific to them?
Kids are easy, and that's I think that's a good and a bad thing, which, we talked about protecting of their data and their conversation, what they're saying in conversation. But if it's something that they enjoy, right, going with coloring, it's easy to kind of build that trust. And the only way that I believe that when we first started to break the trust is when we started with the default fallback, and that did not work, right? Because if you are coloring, you want to have that interaction. You don't want it to say I don't understand, or you don't want it to turn off by itself, because eventually after you've said something about 4 or 5 times, it just kind of shuts off. And that definitely is a way to break trust. And so we had to build around that. We had to understand that if we want to continue the conversation as if they are talking with another person, then you have to make sure that you have those things that are built in to do that. When we were on Alexa, we started at the very beginning, it didn't have a lot of dynamics to it. So we had to build those in. Some of them, just out of the blue, have a database of some very fun sayings that, we pull out and she would say to continue the conversation. And then the other times it's just asking a question of the child and then having them say something to kind of continue the conversation. So that to me is really the way that we were able to build trust, is really not to let the conversation default, but to make it as engaging and allowing them to continue with the experience.
Did you find the same thing, Brett, or did you have a different experience?
Yeah, I guess going back to the earlier thing, I found that there was a lot of trust issues with, the device, and whether or not it would it may not be fully trust, but just, reliability, right? Like whether it would understand you and things like that. And so I found that it was actually pretty difficult to get people to trust it. That continued to be one of our problems. So I don't know if I have the great answers for how to build it, because we continued to struggle with that impression of the devices, that they weren't trustworthy. I think they trusted us as a company, but it was kind of a blocker that a lot of them didn't trust the devices.
Right. I'd actually love to dive a little bit more into accessibility, and I guess how you approached designing and incorporating. I guess multimodal is one approach that you can use, but if you have any other things that you want to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on that. Like you said, multimodal, I think really thinking through the different types of users. So for example, vision issues, making sure that, fonts are big, that they're readable, and clear. I think hearing, being able to make sure that you're clear, have captions. We made sure on our Alexa app that, we supported captions. And what I think some people forget sometimes when they build apps is where you put buttons and images and where the captions are going to come, right? Because a lot of times the captions, they're going to come on a certain part of the screen. But if you don't think about that, then you're putting important information right at the same spot where the captions overlay. So either they don't want to have captions because it blocks things, or you end up blocking it with the captions. So I think, making sure there's captions and make sure you're thinking that through. I think big buttons. I use a virtual reality app, and they have some of these really small buttons, and you have to hold the joystick in this very steady way. So if you have any shaking in your hand or whatever, it's a very small target. It feels like you're trying to hit this tiny little spot. And so I think making sure the buttons are big, easy to click and to read and to see. The cognitive side, I think, again, making sure it's clear, easy. One of the things part of the idea behind Voice PT was for my own cognitive issues with ADHD, and helping guide you always where you were in the exercise, because it's very easy to get a little lost as to where you are in the process. So I think always having that ability of knowing where you're at, how to get back, and so that if someone has lost the context, they can quickly pick it back up, I think are important. So, and I think the voice only part is also, one of the benefits of a voice assistant is that, people that have some of these issues can, we were doing physical therapy and people didn't necessarily want to have to sit there with a small phone and buttons and positioning it and all that. So I think just the nature of a voice assistant alone can be helpful for certain impairments.
Yeah, for us, we tried our best to address a number of needs. Now, a core group were individuals who had difficulty carrying on a conversation. Obviously, you cannot exclude individuals from coming in and from using it, right? So for us, we tried our best as much as possible. Well, first, we couldn't crowd the screen because it was a coloring app. They had to see the actual picture and it being colored, and on the side, we had like some bubbles of different colors that Alexa was using. So we tried our best not to crowd the screen, but as much as possible, whenever there was an interaction, if we could not put any text on the screen about what was being said, we made sure that the rate of speech was appropriate on Alexa. And that helps a lot because you don't, like I said, even though we had our core group, we never know what child, what, what they're, whether they have a deficit or not, they're coming to the skill and how they, what impairment or what they might not be able to understand. So that was one of the things that we definitely did. Obviously, multimodal helped a lot. And like I said, just making sure that what was on the screen was at least visible enough for them to visually see and connect, even if the words weren't there. So that's the way that we addressed it.
I was just going to add real quick. I think something Monique said reminded me. Also, being handling errors and not trapping people into things, or being maybe wording it different. Sometimes just repeating the same thing over and over again doesn't help someone understand. And so like one of the things that I struggled with the app is how quickly, like if you take a second pause to breathe or to think, it thinks you're done speaking, right? And so you need to really be good at that ability to, we can't necessarily always control that part of it, right? But plan for that, so that if someone, only said half of what they needed and then it thought you were done, how to escape, how to come back around to give them another chance, instead of just exiting out or erring or saying, I don't understand, and trapping them in a way that they, get frustrated and just give up. So being really, flexible in that way and helpful and guide, and, and also give them easy out. So if they do, you can say, oh, say no to exit or something simple. You don't want to have to give them a long phrase. If they do want out, don't make it complicated, but also make it easy to just, get back into the flow.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Brett mentioned. For us, we did have a database of words and pronunciation, because you're dealing with young kids. They may not say the words just exactly. So we had to have a database of those things and how they may be pronounced differently. I'm from Louisiana. We sometimes have a lazy tongue around certain consonants and vowels. So we took that into consideration and put it in there. And we got less fallback, less interruptions in the interaction, because Alexa was able to understand, well, hey, this might mean this. The other thing is that even if there was something that was not understood, then that's where we continue a conversation, either asking another question or saying, hey, while you're doing that, let's listen to this. So just kind of pivoting in a different way, not making it so obvious that maybe Alexa didn't understand, but allowing there to be options outside of just words that we can pivot and continue on.
Yeah, it makes sense. I like that we talked about multimodal and we brought it up a couple of times. And I'm always thinking, when these more complex experiences come in, where we have so many elements and stuff going on, what's your process? Like, where do you start? Are you first thinking about the voice and then thinking like attaching an image to it, or do you do the two combined? I'm curious to hear what's your process.
I can say one of the things that I felt was important, at least for voice PT, and it may differ depending on the app, is we were trying to match the same verbiage on the screen to what we said. Because, and I realize sometimes that's not the right way to go, but like for us, we didn't want them confused by seeing, because sometimes people put a shorter, version on the screen, right, than what it's saying. But then sometimes the brain is trying to both listen and read, and if it's a little too different, they get confused, right? And again, there are situations where that is what you want to do, so it's not a rule. But we decided that even though we could add some extra verbiage in, we consciously chose not to, and made sure it was just reading out what was on the screen to be consistent, and to avoid that those cognitive issues of trying to track both at the same time, and potentially sort of not following either, right? When you try to do both, sometimes you get less than if you were just following the same.
And for us, it was picture first, because we did have, obviously, since a multimodal, we did have the screen, and that was what we felt was the most capturing of attention, as opposed to just hearing words. And so we we started out with the picture first and what was going on with the picture. With each picture, there was a story. So as stories were being read, we interjected sound effects and these different things that wouldn't normally come with a read aloud. And so that helped a lot. And that's where we started. And then the conversation was then pulled back out of there because we knew the intent was to have a back and forth about coloring a coloring sheet. Each was attached to a book, associated with a book. And we knew that the child would hear a read aloud. So having the visual experience and the audio, not necessarily words, but like I say, sound effects and music, so on and so forth, was very important to us. And then pulling back and piggybacking on what Brett mentioned, making the wording simple so that there is no confusion about what is actually going on in the conversation, but also you don't want the child to have to focus on so many things, right? Okay, what is this thing saying? And then I'm trying to color too, and all of this stuff is going on, and so we made the language very simple, and so that for us came last in understanding. Okay, all of this is going on. This is what kind of brings everything together. How do we make sure it doesn't overwhelm what's already there?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually wanted to go back to kind of the consent and like how you dealt with these different age groups not always understanding what they're necessarily consenting to and how you kind of approached that.
For us, it was easy because with Alexa, the parent had to be the one to consent and allow the app to be downloaded. And so in that case, obviously you describe what we were doing, whether or not we were capturing the data, what are we going to do with the data. Obviously, once again, with Alexa, there was only certain type of information that we can actually capture. So we did explain, okay, this information does not identify your child in any way. It's just kind of going in a general pool to help us improve the skill. And so that if we understand that kids are getting stuck in one place or can't pronounce certain words, then we understand that we need to change something about what we said in that part of the app. So for us, consent was fairly easy because, like I said, the parent was involved.
Right. Was that the same kind of thing since it was Alexa too, right?
Yeah, and for us, we were mostly targeted older adults, and we weren't targeted at kids, so consent really wasn't too big of an issue for us.
Yeah. In terms of like reviewing all the conversations, were you able to how often, I guess, were you able to do that? And how were you able to incorporate? I guess what was your process for reviewing?
Yeah, we didn't have much. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the stage where we were really reviewing like what people were saying as far as on the backside. But we did, when we were doing testing with people, that it was always interesting to watch how people interacted. And, just like they say, kids say the darndest things to the older adults. And so it was always interesting to me to watch. You think you've set it up so logically that they're going to know how to respond or what to say. And then you watch users, right? And it's just always interesting to see how they actually interact. I still just remember this. It wasn't for our app, but I still remember once I was at a party and someone was playing music over Alexa, and they were trying to change the volume, and they were they couldn't get it to go, and so they started yelling at it more, right? Like lower, lower, lower the volume, as if it would, like an LLM would have gotten it, right? I mean, that's where, but if they were actually making it worse. So the more they were trying to be descriptive and explaining, instead of going back to Alexa, lower volume, it was like they just went off in all these crazy ways. And so I always find it very interesting to watch how people interact with the devices. And I think you really do have to account for that. That's part of where I'm excited to see as LLM type gets more into these voice assistants. I think they will become much better because often people they have the right intents, but they just not always saying the exact right phrase. So once there's a lot better understanding of what they're trying to get at, I think users will find it will meet their needs a lot better and act like they were, because I think, a lot of people just don't think like a programmer, don't think like a conversation designer. And so to us, it often feels logical, but to them, it's not at all. And so then they get, but they feel like they're saying things logically, so they don't understand why it's not, responding correctly.
No, we actually use it a lot, especially because we understood that kids would say things differently or pronounce them differently. So it really helped us there. But one thing that came out was we would have these couple of users that would use it, and they would just say these random words. And I assumed that they were boys because they would say things that boys would kind of say in a classroom, just yell out, right? And so those words were so funny. We actually decided to put some of them inside of the Alexa as her recognizing, it as a color. I hate to say it wasn't anything that obviously was very bad, but it's just those funny kind of quirky things that kids would say just to get a laugh out of everybody in the class. And we decided to use some of those things. And so it was very interesting, and I'm sure surprising to the user that when they said that as a color, Alexa acknowledged that, oh, okay, yeah, I know what that is. And you color it. And so it was really fun to actually look at the data from when kids were using it, and then to interject it and put it back into the app so that they can have a different experience every time.
Oh, that's amazing. And I love that they can then use that, and like it becomes a part of
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
It's almost like an Easter egg that they stumble across.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas before, she might not have really said, I had that color, I'm going to use something else. But when they came back and they used the same word, it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm sure they probably were just kind of laughing because, like I said, it's those words that kids say in a classroom that everybody laughs at. And the teacher may say, don't say that or whatever, but when they're with Alexa, it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Let's go ahead and color it that color. So,
Right. That also builds trust. It builds,
exactly.
People want to come back because you're using the same language they are. You're meeting the users where they are. And that's, I think,
Exactly.
yeah. Giulia, did you have any other questions?
No, not really. I mean, I guess if there's any last words of advice on what you would give to someone who is just starting maybe with building something for kids or older adults that they should know about.
Yeah. I would go back to what I mentioned earlier. When you have your concept, get in front of the people who will be using it. In my case, having that fun time with kids. And whatever it's going to be, whatever the activity is, and get engaged in that and understand, the nuances and the different language and just how they interact and what makes them excited, what causes them to feel like, oh, I'm kind of sad about this because it didn't understand me. Just really immersing yourself in that way, especially like I said, as adults, we get so far away from our childhood, we forget. But that would be my encouragement, number one. And then number two, if you are building a multimodal app, for me, the encouragement is to start with the visual and the kind of sound effects and let the conversation support that, because that for kids is really what pulls them in. The conversation isn't really what they're coming for really. They're coming for what's ever going on in the screen, how the game plays out, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'll add to what Monique said, because I think user testing all the way through the process is really important. I mean, I find that important for all software, but I think, having done a lot of web development, people will, oh, great to see you back. People will sort of figure it out, right? Like if you might make things that isn't quite what they want, but they'll sometimes figure it out. But when it comes to, these kinds of interactions, you really can be so off base in how you designed it compared to how they want to interact it. And, I don't think, like, typically some people do user testing at the end, right? It's like they built the whole thing and then they go out and they start seeing how users do it. And if I could do it over, we would have started a lot earlier getting people to use it, even when it was raw and wasn't, as well polished, because we would have learned a lot more early on. And I think, again, when you're in conversation design, I think it is so much more important than even just like web-based design in understanding how the user is going to talk and interact with it. And, because there can be such a big disconnect if you don't do that. Like I said, whereas the web, they'll often figure it out.
So, any last word of advice or like to share? Well, I think for me, when it comes to designing for the very young and exceptionally old, one of the things that comes about is understanding that it is really human conversation. You want to really meet people where they're at and not where you think that they should be. Very good conversational user experience is essentially something that is invisible. And we always say UX is invisible, but this is really, it shouldn't be something that someone has to learn how to talk to. It should be something that is already where they are and at the level they are at in the direction that they need to be. And for the very young, it can be a little bit, N+1, a little bit of scaffolding to go a little bit beyond that. But it needs to speak in a way that you say something in natural speech and it will do the thing. And so with the old, it needs to be the thing that they understand. And if it can't do a thing, be very acknowledging of it. But the conversational part, that is what it can do. And it is the new level of human-computer interaction, where it's not human-to-computer interaction. It is computer meeting us, humans, in the interaction.
I'll just add to that I think early on, a lot of things I kept hearing about voice assistants was that, oh, there's no learning curve. You just speak to it, it'll understand, right? And and first of all, it doesn't always understand, so there's that part. So I don't know what lab they were in doing that testing when they would come out and say, oh, it's 99% accurate or whatever. But I think they underestimate how there is still quite a learning curve. And again, I think, as I said earlier, with LLMs, I think that's going to really help with that, right? Because people are going to be able to say things, a lot more varieties of ways, and the computer will understand. But currently, I think for a lot of voice assistants, chatbots, it's not quite that clear to people how to use it as some claimed. So,
but I will argue to that point. The very young do not know that they're not supposed to know how to use something, and so it's a different type of learning curve than the one that we're used to. And things like first-time user experiences as a standard user experience design do not work unless they're designed for something that somebody has no clue shouldn't work this way.
I think we should approach a lot of experiences like that, because we just assume that people know how to use things and they don't. And it's, yeah.
Yeah, on the web, a lot of companies have really embraced onboarding and helping guide people, but I found in a lot of voice assistants, they just sort of assume people are going to know what the 4 words that it can recognize are, right? So they'll be like, what do you want to do now? Or, they'll do these open-ended kind of things, and you're like, what makes you think they understand what to do right there? And so I think onboarding needs to be much more a part of voice assistant and chat, but especially with voice, I think then people maybe gave credit for in the beginning and just assumed people will naturally respond, and as long as we put in the right utterances, everything will be good.
Yeah, and I guess with voice it's a little bit harder too, since there's no you don't necessarily have the affordance of the screen, or you don't know where people are when they're using the experience. So it's a challenge that we just have to get better at. So, anything else? Any last thoughts before we close out?
I do have one last thought that I thought would be really fun to bring up, because one of the things that we are seeing is a change in the direction of how things are working, and a change in how people are looking at children interacting with these systems. I don't know if you saw the news, but OpenAI and Mattel, of Barbie renown, have made a connection. And so the idea that we will have now more LLM generative interactions for children, and that it's becoming normalized, is something that I think that we need to see as an opportunity and jump on. So we make sure that it's compliant with children, it understands children, it is designed to keep children safe as its first thing, but also that we're not in the time period where this is a maybe it'll happen. We're in the time period where it's happening and it's an opportunity for us.
I'll add to that, though. I think, and I heard about that recently, and I think it's going to be interesting. But I don't think enough people, when working with LLMs, are really thinking about the safety, security, what topics can be addressed or not. Because I can already envision videos coming out of Barbie saying things that Mattel does not want Barbie saying, right? And and so I think that and I know there's a lot of news out there about ChatGPT and other tools that are giving, really bad advice or, sending people off on the wrong path. So I think that, the good side, the side of LLMs that we have to think more about than the current, like when you don't have the LLMs, is going off track and getting to areas that they shouldn't and whatever. So I think companies really need to make sure that they're thinking through all the different possibilities. I won't go through all that right now, right? But we've probably all heard about those. So I think they need to really keep that in mind.
So this is one of the reasons I brought up my company earlier beforehand, UG Labs. That is explicitly what they do. And I think that having that as a place where you go from, where you very explicitly address that, you address how do you inform parents if something happens, is very exciting during these times. And as parents, listen, if you're a parent watching this, pay attention to what your kid's doing with AIs, because it follows their direction.
Yeah, and I would say I echo that. It's one of those things where, when the computers came and all of these, it's just kind of bombard a lot of parents, and sometimes you don't know what's good, what's bad. The biggest thing is just being engaged, right? Understanding what they're doing, asking questions about what they're doing and how they're using it, letting them show you how they're using it, so on and so forth. I don't expect really small kids, but if they really do get into it, then you have to take the control of that. But as the children get older, you still want to maintain that level of trust with them. So you engage with that conversation and understand the language of, of what they're using, right? If you don't understand, then ask them to teach you or to show you. And that's another way to kind of continue to have that trust with them and still allow them to have engaged in what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're over time. So thank you all so much for being here. This was so insightful. I learned so much. And yeah, we have another panel next week. So stay tuned. And yeah, thank you for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having us.
Thank you.